engagement. We've been doing this series of virtual author events for the past couple of weeks and having a blast. We're doing them basically every Monday and Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, but we have had a few anomalies, and we certainly did not want to turn down the opportunity to speak with John Grisham about his new book and about a lot of other things. I want to tell you guys, we're going to be posting some links in the chat here so you can buy your copy of CAMINO Winds. John has been kind enough to provide some signed copies for us. So if you get that book today, we will be getting those signed copies out to you ASAP. So make sure you do that. Thank you all for buying tickets. This is our first kind of paid virtual author event. It's kind of an experiment. All of that money that you bought for your tickets will certainly go back to us. One of the reasons John has been kind enough to do this is because he supports indie bookstores so passionately. So thank you for contributing in that way, and buying a copy of the book will do even more for us. Many of you guys know that Magic City Books is owned and operated by the nonprofit Tulsa Literary Coalition. So everything we do, whether it's a book sale or a cup of coffee or whatever we do, all goes back into the programming like this that we can provide, hopefully in person at some point. But we're going to be doing these for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to start our chat with the great John Grisham. Hello, John.
Hello. Hello. Hey, Jeff. How you doing?
Yeah, so glad to have you here. I wish we could have done this in person, but we will have to push that a little bit further down the road. But welcome to Tulsa virtually. Yeah.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. I want to spend just a second talking about the new book. Now, the new book is a sequel, and it's hard to talk about a thriller, especially a sequel, without giving too much away. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because spoilers abound. But maybe you could talk for just a second about why you felt the kind of call to write the sequel and what your kind of vision was from the beginning with the project.
When I finished Camino Island 3 years ago, it was a whole lot of fun to write because there were no lawyers in the book. And I knew I would go back to this fictional island, fictional town, fictional bookstore, this fictional literary mafia of writers on this small town. And I really enjoyed them and writing about them. And I knew I would go back for at least 2 more books. I sold Winds and the next book to Doubleday. So I've got another one coming after this. Don't have a story yet. That could be a problem. But I wanted to write a pure murder mystery. And over the years, I've killed off so many lawyers and judges. I thought it was time to kill off a writer. And so we have one of our writers on the island who's part of the gang is discovered dead the morning after a horrible hurricane hits Camino Island. And his friends find him, and they are suspicious because his death was meant to appear to be an accident, and they realize it was not an accident. And so they have a hard time convincing the police, who are occupied with the hurricane, to take it serious and to investigate. And so then the police don't. They're too busy elsewhere. Small town policemen and overwhelmed by a Category 4 hurricane and all the damage. And so our hero, Bruce Cable, who owns Bay Books, the bookseller, the star of the books, he and a buddy and a couple of buddies decide they've got to solve the crime. And so here we go. Off to the Hardy Boys in their 40s take off to solve a mystery.
I like the middle-aged Hardy Boys angle. That's fun.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of these fictional bookstores. Bay Books. When you were thinking about it in your mind's eye and kind of wondering what this would look and feel like, was there a model that you used in your head for another bookstore that kind of was the template for what Bay Books would become?
Square Books in Oxford. We lived in Oxford for 4 years, and even before we moved there, we were regulars at Square Books. It's my favorite bookstore. It's 2 stories with a cafe upstairs, coffee bar, and a porch, an old porch where I got books signed by Barry Hannah and Larry Brown and a lot of guys back in the glory days when they were still alive. A lot of book signings back in the 80s and early 90s, and that was a real hangout for us. Then we moved to Oxford in 1990 and thought we'd be there forever. And I've just always, and early on, when A Time to Kill was published in 1989, most bookstores did not have time for an unknown writer with a new book by an unknown publisher. And that was me. And there were 5 independent bookstores around where I live. Square Books was the first book signing, the first place to open the doors and said, come on in. Burke's Bookstore in Memphis, Reed's in Tupelo, Lemuria in Jackson, in a bookstore in Blytheville, Arkansas. And so when the firm came out 2 years later, year and a half later, all the bookstores wanted, they suddenly had time, and I didn't want to go to all of them. So I went back to the first 5 for many years. But I modeled Bay Books after Square Books. I know nothing about the retail side of book selling and don't want to learn. I know it's tough, so I used a lot of fiction. Bruce is he's kind of a roguish character. He loves books, loves writers, loves female writers who are traveling alone, loves the ladies, loves long lunches, and lives the good life, and runs a bookstore. He's there every day. He reads a lot during the day, and he makes a ton of money with almost no staff. So I don't know how. Thank God for fiction. Okay, that's the way I set it up. But that's Bay Books.
I had the great opportunity. I wrote an obit piece for Publishers Weekly. I was assigned when Barry Hannah passed away, and I went down to Oxford and wrote this piece. And I had been there before and spent time at Square Books, and it really is. Square Books is kind of like, if you imagine the perfect bookstore, it really is kind of like that. It's almost like this, right in the middle of this beautiful college town. But I was always fascinated by that short period of time, relatively, where there were these people like Larry Brown and Barry and yourself and other people kind of all there at the same time.
Yeah.
Can you kind of describe what the milieu was like and what it felt like to be kind of in that moment?
Well, it goes back to the late 70s when I was in law school at Ole Miss. Willie Morris came home from New York. He had been off for 10 or 15 years. He was the youngest editor ever of Harper's Magazine. He lived the big life in New York City and knew every writer. Willie Morris knew everybody. And he got shoved out and finally came back home to Mississippi as the writer in residence at Ole Miss. Which was a full-time job. That's what he needed. And Willie he hated the classroom, wasn't going to teach. His idea of fun was to bring all of his New York buddies down to Oxford for 3 or 4 days to drink. And so we had a law school professor, a law school professor who loved literature, and he would give us extra credit to go listen to these lectures by the likes of James Dickey, Robert Halberstam, William Styron, Robert Penn Warren. That was the literary atmosphere in Oxford when I was in law school. And I finished law school and went back to my hometown an hour away. And then Richard started Square Books, I think about 1985, somewhere in there. I don't think he was there when I was in law school. And by the time we moved there in 1990, Willie was there still holding court. Barry Hannah was a professor. Larry Brown had kind of made it. He was on this big stage. And they were always bringing writers in, and the hangout was the bookstore. And so that's where I hung out, went to dozens of signings there. Met a lot of great writers over the years. It was a wonderful literary environment back in the early 1990s. Now they're all dead. They're all gone. Although Oxford now has a lot of working writers, fiction writers, and novelists in town, and it attracts people. And there's a MFA program at Ole Miss that's very active, and so it was a special time. And you
have a writer's residency program there that you either endowed or run, correct?
Yeah, about 25 years ago, my wife and I, we didn't endow. We put up the money to bring in an emerging Southern writer. Every year would come to Ole Miss for a year to live, to party, to work a little bit, to write a book. And it became a very well-known program. We had a lot of great writers come through, and we still do it. We now do it every other year, but it's still very vibrant and much sought after.
You mentioned that you love bookstores, but you don't know anything about the retail side of it. But I'm curious. I bet you've probably been approached a million times about being one of these authors that has a bookstore, you know, like the Anne Patchett kind of model, the Louise Erdrich kind of model. Has that been broached to you even as like a silent partner? Like, hey, you want to open a bookstore with us somewhere?
I'm having a hard time. I cannot remember that happening. They probably, well, everywhere we've lived, though, we've lived in Oxford, Mississippi for 4 years. And we moved to Charlottesville, Virginia 25 years ago. And there are plenty of bookstores in both towns. So, I mean, well, Square Books is a dominant bookstore in Oxford. It dominates the whole region in a good way. In Charlottesville, there's a very high rate of consumption of books by the people. It's a very high per capita. It's a great book town with lots of secondhand bookshops, a really strong independent, a Barnes and Noble near the campus that's very, very busy. So there are plenty of bookstores. So maybe that's why no one's ever asked me to start one.
So we were talking before we kind of came into the public room here about, you know, you're kind of holed up at home here in Virginia. I was listening to, you're going to be doing a talk later today, actually, with Stephen King. And I was listening to his recent interview with Terry Gross, and she asked him about being quarantined and what that's been like. And he said, you know, he was using the time to work on a new novel, right? Because there was nothing else to do. Has this impacted your productivity? You're obviously very prolific, but are you writing any more than usual, or the vice versa? Are you feeling the weight of this whole situation as kind of a negative impact on your writing?
I start a new legal thriller every year on January the 1st, and my deadline is July the 1st. So I have 6 months to write the book. And I love to write January, February, and March because there's not much else going on. And I get a lot of work done then. I stay on schedule. What the pandemic has done for me is kept me at home. Normally we would be traveling a bit more, smaller trips, quicker trips. For example, I was supposed to go to France early this month for a big book festival in Lyon. I went to it 5 years ago. It's a great book festival. And that would have been 5 days gone. So that, you know, that's 5 more days at the typewriter. So I'm writing a lot. It's a nice diversion. It's still fun to go over to the office at home on the farm at about 7 every morning. And for 3 or 4 hours, it's very quiet. My office has no phones, no fax, no internet, no music. It's a very, you know, kind of a dark place that I go to every morning. And I've been more productive simply because I can't travel. So I'm ahead of schedule for the next legal thriller that'll be out in October.
You had some great success with the Innocent Man project,
Yeah.
obviously with ties directly here to Oklahoma. Right. And then the Netflix adaptation of that. The CAMINO project seems like it's ripe for a long-form television project, but we haven't seen a ton of movies the way we did from in the 90s and even the early 2000s. Is that kind of a choice you made to kind of pull back on some of those adaptations? There's so many books that have happened in the last 20 years that have seemed perfect for that.
I think so. I would love to see every book adapted to film or television because we all love a good movie, you know, and I've had great success with Hollywood. I've had 10 of the books adapted. The last one was The Innocent Man, was a documentary and very well done by Netflix. I had nothing to do with it. But, excuse me, if you go back to the early 1990s and the first wave of movies, it was The Firm, Pelican Brief, Client, Rainmaker, Time to Kill, Runaway Jury. The Chamber was not a very good movie, didn't do well. But the first rush of movies 25 years ago now, a different generation, they had big casts, they had top directors, they had big domestic box office success, big foreign grosses, and everybody made money. And those movies are still on TV somewhere tonight being recycled, still selling books. And for some reason, that model doesn't work today in Hollywood. Hollywood, the studio system is so screwed up these days. The studios would rather spend $200 million with Spider-Man 10 to try to gross $2 billion in China. That's their model. That's why you see so few smart adult dramas made. There just aren't that many of them. And everybody's going to television. That's where the money is, the talent. And, you know, with streaming, we all love it because you can, and there's so much good stuff there. So it's not by choice that everything I've written is for sale. Everything that has not been adapted is for sale. And we have, at any given time, we'll have half a dozen deals in the works. We sold Racketeer last week. We're about to sell Calico Joe, probably for television, you know, who knows. But nothing is being filmed right now. Netflix and HBO have plenty of money, but you can't film right now. And you know, look at the future of movies. Going to the movie theater, it's going to really impact feature film. So, no, I've not had a feature film in 15 years, which is a long time. And I really can't control it. I can't do anything today. CAMINO WINDS came out yesterday. I cannot do anything to get that movie made. If I gave away the film rights for free, if I wrote the screenplay for free, if I did all that and said, you know, I can't get it done. So I've learned I don't make movies. I don't know how. I'm not going to learn. I have no patience with the business. All I can do is stay at home and write. And that's what I do.
You know, there was a television adaptation of The Firm, but I was thinking more about some authors who revisit characters. You know, we were talking about Stephen King. You know, you wrote Dr. Sleep, which was a revisit of the characters from The Shining. Do you ever kind of feel tempted? You're obviously doing sequels in the Camino series. Do you ever feel tempted to kind of revisit Jake Brigance or Mitch McDear or any of these characters and kind of do a Where Are They Now follow-up to some of these situations?
Funny you should ask. Funny, I spent 3 hours with Jake this morning. The next legal thriller is a return to Ford County, 5 years after A Time to Kill story, 5 years after the trial of Carl Lee Haley. And I've gone back once with Jake in a book called Sycamore Row that came out 7 years ago. And so I'm back in court with Jake in a big sensational murder trial in Ford County, Mississippi. And I'm 500 pages into the book. So I'm almost done. And I really like the story. It's going well. So that'll be out in October.
That's fantastic. Almost seemed like a planted question. It wasn't. So, you know, Tulsa had a kind of a fun presence in The Firm. You know, you had Gene Triplehorn, you had Gary Busey in there, and even in The Rainmaker, you had our own Mary Kay Place doing a fantastic role in that. So, you know, Tulsa is well represented in the early Grisham film oeuvre. When you're revisiting a character like Jake Brigance, just since we're talking about that, I'm just curious, is that kind of like riding a bike in terms of the voice of a character like that? Obviously that was your first book.
Yeah.
31 years later.
Yeah. It's, I waited a long time between A Time to Kill and Sycamore Row because I didn't have a story. It all starts with a story. I was also very worried about, when I wrote A Time to Kill in 1985, I was Jake Brigance. I was that small town lawyer in Mississippi, struggling, dreaming of the big trial because that's what I wanted to do with my career. I wanted to be in the courtroom. I wanted to be a big time trial lawyer. And I wanted the big case where, I was in the center of the ring. You know, that's what I dreamed of. I never got it. But I was living that life, and I had a young wife at home, and she's having babies, and life is. The pressures of success in a small town, the frustrations of a small town law practice because it's difficult with so many. Yeah, I was very much living that. And then that was 35 years ago. And then 25 years went by, or at least before I wrote Sycamore Row. And when I wrote it, my wife was not too crazy about the idea because so much had changed in our lives. We were the same people with the same values that we were in 1985, 1990, but our lives had changed dramatically. And I was much older, and I was writing in the voice of a young lawyer that time was 35 years old. So yeah, we worried about that. But once I got the book Sycamore Row written, I knew the story worked, and there was never any more doubt about, do I have the same voice as I had when I was writing at the age of 30? And so we kind of got past that. And I was not planning on going back to Jake anytime soon. One problem with a character like Jake, who's a small town lawyer, you can't have a big sensational murder trial every other year. It just doesn't happen that way. So I kind of had to space them out. And And that's why I can't go back there all the time. I love that place. I love that setting. I love to write about those people because that's where I come from. But I can't do a Jake book, every other year.
Do you think that a career like yours, especially kind of the way it took off, is possible now for a fiction writer in 2020?
It's always possible. And in publishing needs new stars all the time who can produce a book a year or a book every other year and draw crowds into bookstores. Publishing needs it, but it's kind of worrisome because Stephen King and I laugh about it. We're old men now, and we've been at it for a long time. If you look at the top 10 best-selling authors in America, I can't tell you who the youngest one is, but they're almost all over 50 or over 60. And publishing needs a brand new 30-year-old rock star who can, if it's police crime or mysteries or whatever it is, thrillers, suspense, in popular fiction, we need some new blood. And I think it can always happen. So somebody's going to come out with a book and make it happen. And we need that. We need it desperately. It's not competition for us. There's never any competition. The marketplace is too big.
Well, it's so funny you say it because I guess in some ways the rock star breakout of the past year is the 70-year-old Delia Owens with Where the Crawdads Sing, which is kind of the biggest book of the last 2 years. You know, and it was her first novel, and so who knows? It's interesting, but even things like that's kind of a Secret Life of Bees kind of model. A book comes out of nowhere and really takes on the culture. So it's always exciting to see that a book can still grab on.
It happens every year, and every year it's very difficult to get published. It's always been difficult to get published. It's always, Stephen King and I can tell stories for hours about our initial rejections and how we struggle to get. That's true with almost every writer. That's part of it. And nowadays it's different because of the market's different, because of the internet, because of Amazon. It's all different, but it's going to happen. Every year new writers are going to debut, and some will work, some won't. But and I tell students that, it's a very discouraging process to go through. It looks intimidating. It looks very daunting to try to get your book published, but it's going to happen each year to several hundred debut authors.
What's it like right now having no baseball in your life?
It's awful. It's terrible. It's terrible. I have a Little League baseball park that I built around the corner from my farm, and we have 7 fields and 400 to 500 kids each year playing from T-ball through age of 15. It's girls softball, and I've had it for 25 years, and it's a very special place. I'm still the commissioner because nobody else wants that job. I'm still the owner because I can't give it to anybody else, so it's mine, and it's empty. It's gorgeous this time of the year. We've had a beautiful spring here in Virginia. It's been warm, and the colors are more vibrant than ever. It's just a gorgeous spring, and no baseball in the afternoon. I follow college baseball, and that's not happening. And I follow the Cardinals and professionally, and it's awful. It's terrible with no baseball. Baseball has survived depressions and wars, and now this is just awful.
Have you found yourself reading more during quarantine? And I'm just curious what you're reading recently, if there's some stuff you love that you want to talk about that you've enjoyed.
I'm not sure I'm reading more. I'm buying more. I'm really trying to help out the bookstores, and it's a great time to build a library. My goal for this pandemic is to read all 6 novels in order by Walker Percy. And I'm in the middle of the second one now. You can't get in a hurry when you read Walker Percy. You have to go slow because he writes slow, or he wrote slow. So that's my ongoing project. I've finished Harlan Coben's latest book. Because I read Harlan. I heard yesterday that Scott Turow is coming out. Is it next week? So there are a handful of writers that, when they publish a book, I'm going to go buy it and read it right then. Scott's one of them because we're old buddies and we're lawyers, and I've always loved Scott's stuff. Michael Connelly, Dennis Lehane, Harlan Coben, John le Carre is an old favorite from the UK, the old espionage guy he published last month, and I read his book. So there are, a few that get me out every time to the bookstore. So I've always got some like serious project going on, like Walker Percy, but also I like to keep up with what's happening in popular fiction.
Is the Walker Percy thing just something as you just do to kind of personal challenge to yourself?
Yeah.
Like you just kind of, let's talk about Walker Percy for a second. I'm just curious because why not give a little platform to someone people may or may not know well? Most popular book, probably The Moviegoer, I would imagine. It's probably the most well-known. Is that your favorite Walker Percy book?
I read that one, 30 years ago. It came out in 1960, won the National Book Award. It was the only Walker Percy I had read before. I reread it starting middle of last month. Finished it a couple of weeks ago because I take those real slow. I'm halfway through The Last Gentleman right now. I think Lancelot is next. Yeah, I mean, they're it's not this is not popular fiction. He writes these very complicated psychological studies of people, and there's not a whole lot of action. There's not a whole lot of plot with Walker Percy, but it's worth the effort to take them slow and plow through them. But he's such a great writer. He's so smart and so observant, and he just baffles me with his vocabulary. I'll see a word I've never seen before. I'll go to the dictionary. They've never seen it either. Okay, the word doesn't exist, and he does that all the time. But it's a real challenge.
I was at an event one time with the director Terrence Malick, and he was speaking, and he had talked about making a movie of The Moviegoer, and it was going to star Tim Robbins and Julia Roberts. Okay, and someone asked him why he had not made that film yet, and this was maybe a year or two after Hurricane Katrina, and his answer was that New Orleans doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
Like he couldn't make it then, because it really does capture that city in a way that not a lot of books, not other than maybe Confederacy of Dunces, some other books have, but it's a pretty special book. So you're reading all that stuff. You talked about Scott Turow. While we have just a few minutes left, I'm curious to, why do you think in the moment that the league, because Turow and you kind of came around about the same time. I want to say Presumed Innocent probably came around a year or two before.
87.
Yeah. What was it about legal thrillers in that moment do you think just caught the zeitgeist? Was there something, because like things like that don't happen organically.
Tough question. I'm not sure I can answer it. When Presumed Innocent came out in 1987, as far as I remember, the genre was pretty much dead. The legal thriller. There had been other guys before us, before Scott, but he just electrified the genre of legal thrillers. And he got so much attention, sold so many books. And I was trying to finish writing my first novel when Presumed Innocent came out, and it was a huge motivational boost to me to get my book finished. And I've told Scott that, but that really fired me up. I got it finished. A Time to Kill didn't work. It was a total flop, but by then I was in the habit of writing every day, and I had this story for something far more commercial, and that turned out to be The Firm. And when The Firm came out in March of '91, it became real popular real fast, and I've never looked back. But it was just a fluke that Scott and I both came out about the same time, and both lawyers, and both wrote books that were very popular.
Is there anything to, the way that the Time to Kill happened has some urban myth around it? You hear a lot about, your name gets dropped a lot. Say, he was the self-published author and he would sell the books out of his trunk. There's a lot of kind of apocryphal stuff happening around that story. Is that all true? Has some of it become blown out of proportion over time with people telling, using you as kind of a model for how to kind of break into things? How much of that has kind of
it wasn't self-published
over the last?
It wasn't self-published. It was I got paid $15,000 up front for A Time to Kill by a small unknown publisher in New York, so it was not self-published. I did go to 35 libraries in Mississippi for punch and cookies with the ladies of the libraries, with extra books in my trunk in case we needed them. So I had books in the trunk of my car. But I'd go to bookstores like Square Books and Lemuria and Jackson and Burks in Memphis, and they had plenty of books. They had, they had stocked the store. So I didn't sell all those books out of the trunk, but the book didn't sell very well. I mean, again, they printed 5,000 initial copies and never went back for any more, and never went back for the paperback until years later. So it was pretty much a non-event. It didn't launch my career because nobody knew about the book. The firm, changed all that.
When you get an idea for a book, you mentioned just a little while ago that everything starts with the story. When you get the initial kind of that aha moment where the kind of brief outline of maybe a story or an idea comes to you, does it feel the same way, as exciting as it did, 30 years ago? Do you kind of still feel like that's the thing and it comes to you in a moment?
Yeah, it's still a whole lot of, it's still very gratifying. And I'll give you an example. I've written two novels about football, one novel about baseball. And I love college basketball. And I've been thinking for years I should write a novel about college basketball. Didn't have the story. Tried to force a story, didn't work. Nothing is written down. And with no March Madness, that really killed us. And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about a story for college basketball, and I think I finally got it. And it's kind of fun initially to think that might become a novel, and real soon. So it's still exciting when the stories come, but I can't force them to come. I can think about them. I can work on them, and I do that. I study lawyers and law firms and trials and courts and appeals, and that's where I live. That's my world, just by curiosity, and I get the ideas from that. But it's still pretty exciting when a real good idea comes along.
Before we ask our final question, I just want to remind everybody, there's links in the comments here. You can order your copy. They're going to be signed. John has been kind enough to do that for us. We'll be getting those to you quickly, but you need to get your copy today. We hope you will do that. Last question is this, and it kind of feeds into what you were just talking about, which is, are there a lot of John Grisham unfinished projects sitting in drawers or on hard drives somewhere? Do you kind of abandon things? Do you keep a box full of little notes and ideas, or once you kind of start something, you're committed to finishing it?
There are a lot of notes in files in the computer, a lot of story ideas, a lot of magazine articles that I'll file away for future reference. I'm always searching. Yeah. As far as abandoning a novel, I've never done that. By the time I start a novel, I have a very good idea of where it's going. I have a pretty good outline, and I'm just not going to take off after something that I don't know how it's going to end, or maybe I can't even finish it. I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I'm very methodical. I plot the story out, outline it. And when I start, I know where I'm going, and I've got a deadline to get there, a calendar deadline. And I rarely have a down day or a bad day or no writer's block because I know what the story is.
Well, you've said CAMINO WINS is kind of hitting at the perfect time because we all need a little bit of an escape. We need to kind of step outside of our anxiety and step outside of the news cycle and just get out of our headspace. And this is the perfect book to do that. If you guys haven't read it yet or haven't gotten a copy yet, please do. If you haven't read the first book, make sure you catch up and read both so you're all caught up for the series. And there will be a third one on the way at some point, yes?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. And on behalf of everybody watching, we wish you the best with the book, and we hope to see you in person at some point.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. See you.
See ya.